Honestly, man, I think that's overrated. I
Really?
think we're all taught that. I was certainly taught that as a young musician of like, you should master the rules of the craft before you break them, that sort of thing.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
But some of the artists I most revere didn't seemingly do that. You know,
Mm.
they some amount of mastery has to be there to be able to put things together, but to really say like, oh, you need to achieve whatever John Coltrane level mastery or Beethoven level mastery before you can do your own thing, I think is a disservice to finding your own voice a lot of times.
What's up, everybody? Toru here. Welcome back to another episode of Producer Head. Today's guest, I think, really at the core, you can see how deep and genuine his appreciation for music is, just as a fan and a listener. And I think that is very much what's at the core and drives his enthusiasm as a student of music. And because he is involved in such a vast variety of tasks and work, we covered a lot of topics in this conversation, from production as an individual to being a hired gun to help produce other people's albums, to being a mix engineer, to being a drummer, to being an entrepreneur. And something that he wanted to share that we didn't get into the conversation was that no two musicians have identical career paths. And I think that is a really nice reminder and factual piece of information to remind us that no matter where we are, to not be discouraged because of what is happening to us doesn't seem to mirror what we're seeing elsewhere. And beyond that, I think our guest today is somebody who had a lot of answers for us today, but also is aware of how much he doesn't know. And so he also really expressed a lot of his own curiosity and passion to continue learning and improving in his own ways. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Matt Wyatt. Hello, everybody. This is Toru. Welcome back to another episode of Producer Head. From Charlottesville, Virginia, Matt Wyatt. How are you, man?
Good. Good to see you, Toru. Thanks for taking
Yeah,
time to
man.
do this.
Oh, man. Nice to be here with you. And we were chatting a little bit offline, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about why is it that drummers are also good producers?
Yeah. I think the big reason there is because drummers are always thinking about groove and
Hmm.
texture. And I think when it comes to production, groove and texture matter immensely. You know, and by texture, I mean because we're not playing pitch specific instruments in the way a pianist might or whatever, we're thinking, how does the sound, what is this? First of all, how do you even describe the sound of a cymbal, for example, or the sound of shakers or the sound of a snare drum, right? And so immediately as drummers, we're in this space of trying to come up with language, which means developing our ears for hearing texture. And I think for me in production, especially modern production, a lot of how things are working is texture, much more than by way of melody and harmony, for example. So to be like, maybe there's one chord, maybe there's a repeating bass line and a vocal. How do I create interest with this over the course of 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever it is? And I think for me, over and over again, it's the texture piece with drums and percussion that I'm so thankful to have. You know, I started playing when I was 9, so having that early education without even knowing that's what was going on, that was really important. Yeah, for
Yeah.
ear training.
Texture is a really interesting word
Yeah.
in music production, and I find myself using that word a lot too. But how would you try to explain to the rest of us something that's a tactile adjective?
Mm-hmm.
How does that apply to something like music?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so in theory, a lot of times texture and timbre, like timbre, are are interchanged, but they're actually not quite the same. And to me, texture is, um, using words like, is it gritty? Is it warm? And all the words that retailers trying to sell us equipment use are great texture words. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's real fuzzy. It's real like over. It's warm in the mid, but a little bit smooth and buttery up top, right? And so I
Mm.
think that it's tricky to define in the sense that like it's not very quantitative, but I think its value on a qualitative side is absolute, and all of us are responding to it all the time. Yeah. And I even think of this like zooming out, now there's a lot of people of the belief of like, what does sound quality matter anymore? Because we're consuming music through our iPhone speakers or whatever, like laptop speakers. But for me, there's still texture of the sound, tone, the big picture texture that's being communicated no matter the playback system. It's going to be communicated at different levels of detail and granularity maybe, but I think that our response to texture and sound is actually maybe the most vital thing in terms of how we listen to music. I think it might be the most important thing, even if we don't know how to talk about it. We stumble through talking about it, and we aren't even conscious of it a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because it's just not something, I think, beyond when you're reading like some marketing language or when you're in a conversation like this, people think harmony, pitch, melody and rhythm. Yeah. And texture really applies to all of those things. Yes. And so, but it's not really technically talked about. So I'm wondering, I know it is hard to quantify. And so I'm wondering if maybe, is there a spectrum that you think of maybe of texture and like a physical item that you can attach to like either end of the spectrum as a way to maybe frame and think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in terms of rough to smooth a lot with sound. And a kind of geeky way to talk about that is saturation, right? If you picture distorting a sound, it gets rough quickly. But it's not, for me, the rough to smooth kind of spectrum is not just about distortion. It also applies to how bright or dark a sound is, how reverberant a sound is versus how present. So like sometimes if something's like mixed really dry and upfront, to me it'll feel very smooth, even if the sound is gritty and distorted. I don't know how to explain that really, but I think a lot in terms of, if you think rough to smooth and then natural world textures. So leaves, soil, stone, trees, and really thinking of those things, not in the sense of like, oh, I'm hearing a trumpet and it reminds me of leaves or whatever. I don't think of it that way so much, but how do you talk about the way a fallen leaf feels in the palm of your hand? And then try to use that language, use that sensibility in that language when you go into listening mode.
Yeah, it sounds like there's this sense of try to be somewhat imaginative and less literal as a guide for literal things instead of being really like turn this knob or use this device.
Definitely. Yeah. That's a good way to say it. And I think that's a guiding principle for me with composition and with mixing and with producing, all those things. Like really thinking about, because honestly, a lot of times, and this is maybe this is something that sometimes serves me and sometimes works against me, but I'm not that interested a lot of times in music that sounds like it's honoring the principles of a genre at a really high level. Like I appreciate that as a museum in the way I might as a museum preservation of like, wow, that's incredible how high level, pure aesthetic embodiment of this style of music, of the rules of this style of music that this is right now. But for me in my own music, I have no interest in that. It's a mashup. And I think then when you get into that, it's like, well, what are your guiding principles? If you're doing a mashup or if you're going into music and you're not saying, oh, this is a funk tune or this is a, whatever, bebop, like, then what are you using? Because when you make those decisions, that has a lot to do with what the harmony, melody, and rhythm are doing. And as soon as you remove those decisions, then to me, leading from, as you said, like a much more intuitive place and a much more textural place is actually a beautiful way to proceed, because all of a sudden the choices you're making are like fresh,
Interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting to describe things that it maybe follow genre-specific norms as museum type pieces.
Sounds harsh. I don't mean it that harsh. Yeah, but
no, I don't think it sounded harsh. I think it's an interesting way, and so I guess that makes me curious about how you think about what is artistry,
Yeah. Um, Both.
Mm.
And that's where I think the harshness I have to let go of, because for example, when I'm mixing, most of the stuff I mix is very firmly in one genre or another, where, oh, okay, this is like retro soul, or this is folk, or this is whatever. I don't necessarily think that way when I'm mixing it, but if I step back,
Hmm.
that's an easy way to describe it. Um, and in that field, I'm aspiring to get better and better along the lines of, I guess you could say, expectations of artistry, right? Like, to make a great mix of this style of music, there are some characteristics of it that need to be there. If it's funk, the bass needs to hit in a certain way, and the kick drum and the snare needs to have a certain pop to it. And so, but I think when I talk about being more genre agnostic and being more texture driven, that definition of artistry is more how I apply that to my own work. And I think in my production work, it's this interesting mix where, because I produce, when we use that word, a lot of the production I do is old school production. I'm in the room with another human. I also do the kind of hip hop definition of production with my own music. But when I'm working with other people, a lot of times it's not about my definition of artistry, right? I'm not leading from, oh, here's my, like, I'm anti genre, like, let's go in and tear your music apart. If someone's showing up and that's not what their vision is or their goals are, I can set that aside. And then the definition of artistry is, to me, how well am I listening to this artist? How well am I helping them to focus their sound? Um, and to find their sound. That's a lot of what recording offers us, is this chance of really dialing in our sound and our approach. And that's part of what I love about traditional production, is being an ally and an advocate in that process, where I'm in the room with someone and responding. They say, oh, I want to work with this. And I respond to that with perspective that's hopefully helpful and feedback, as opposed to responding to it with, well, no, that doesn't fit into this box or that box. Does that make sense? Did I skirt around that question? I might have, yeah.
No, I. It made me think of something really interesting that I think is kind of underneath this, which
Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit more about, which is because I think there is this sense in my experience where people kind of think you are either kind of doing something squarely down a particular lane or genre,
Mm-hmm.
and then there are artists that say, I'm not going to do that, or I'm not going to spend time with that. That's a waste of time, because then I'm not, maybe in a sense, feeling like you're being creative or doing your own thing.
Mm-hmm.
But to continue with this museum idea, I'm wondering, how important is it to go to the museum and understand and study as a means to be able to be more agnostic or free flowing in what it is you choose to make on your own time?
Honestly, man, I think that's overrated. I
Really?
think we're all taught that. I was certainly taught that as a young musician, of like, you should master the rules of the craft before you break them, that sort of thing.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
But some of the artists I most revere didn't seemingly do that.
Mm.
They some amount of mastery has to be there to be able to put things together, but to really say, like, oh, you need to achieve whatever John Coltrane level mastery or Beethoven level mastery before you can do your own thing, I think is a disservice to finding your own voice a lot of times. And I know this
Mm.
is a hot topic, and like I say, most of my mentors and teachers over the years were not, that was not their belief system at all. It was much more like, get your act together and then you can do your own thing.
Wow. So I mean, yeah. Can you talk about that? Maybe some people and what they helped you see in that direction, and maybe how you were able to maybe self-assess and be like, okay, I have enough. I know that I'm not Beethoven, but I know that I have enough to now start going to do my thing. Or were you just always doing your thing and just always pushing against the limits of what you could do at the time from like a technical perspective?
I think more the latter, man. I still don't feel
Mm.
like I have enough skill.
Mm.
I'm far from that. In anything I do, I feel like, man, wow, yeah, no. But I think that for me, what's become more undeniable over time is that I've always been doing my own thing in parallel to also studying and trying to improve. and that both of those are important. I'm not saying it's not important to be disciplined and pursue the rules of the craft or get chops on your instruments or whatever, but I think that the way I was taught was you go down this pathway first, and once you arrive at X point, then you do your own thing. Whereas to me, those two can be in parallel more.
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, now I'm kind of asking selfishly for myself because that is how I, as you know, to some extent, that's how I really kind of spend my time. There's like part study and part practice and then part making things and experimenting with stuff. And I'm wondering if you have a conscious way in which you split your time or if it's more free flowing or if it's neither of those things.
So you're asking about time between making my own stuff and practicing instruments and
yeah, and balancing all of that, and as we'll get into, right, you have also the responsibilities like you mentioned and of working with other artists and helping them realize their things.
I mean, that's a struggle for me, honestly. Like I don't it's a struggle to balance making practice time with making time, and I think that with creating time is what I mean by that. And I think that the way I've answered that for this phase of my life is I do the creating, the self-generating stuff in chunks. And I do my practices, which for me is drums, or I sit at piano several times a week as much as possible. So those kind of routines are more like exercises for a lot of people or whatever. For me, where it's like I want to show up, it's a way I feel grounded and feel tuned in. It's a way I keep learning, but it's very hard, as you're pointing out, to transition from I'm practicing drums or piano or singing or whatever, and then all of a sudden I'm in trying to like come up with an original seed idea for a piece. So I've found that when I chunk time, meaning like it could mean like, okay, cool, this weekend I have a lot of time, Saturday through Monday, I'm going to really like carve that out. Or it could mean I'm going to take this week and block it out in July or whatever it is. But for me, thinking of it that way is the way I've resolved that. But I don't feel like, I think in an ideal world, I would be maintaining both on a daily basis all the time. But that's just not, I've only succeeded at that for short periods of time.
When you're practicing, before you sit down, do you already know what you're going to do? Or is it more what kind of comes to you?
Well, no, my practice at this point is super open. Yeah, like on drums the last few months, I've been practicing at 50 BPM, which is miserable. It's miserable. Wow. Yeah, like really slow. But within that, I'm playing free. I'm improvising, I'm soloing, and then problems arise. Oh, I'm rushing this. It's always rushing at 50 BPM. And then I'll just hone in on that for a while. And when I sit at a piano, I might think like, I want to mess with a chord progression idea, or I want to work with a bass line in my left hand. But I'm not a disciplined practicer in the conventional way of talking about that. I'd be a terrible student of a music teacher right now. Yeah, at this phase of my life. I mean,
on one hand, but I would imagine of all the people listening, there's got to be very few who have made a song at 50 BPM. So I think the question would be, why practice at 50 BPM? What's the value? What's the motivation there?
Better time. And I think time and groove are deeply important to me. And not that all the music I listen to has that, but when it has that, I want it to feel really grounded in a certain way. And as you know from recording presents a very undeniable reflection. So like I do record drums for people on a regular basis, and I'll look at my drums on the grid and I'll say, oh man, it's like if this fill rushed or if that fill dragged, or if it's a groove that's a little more awkward underhand or whatever, like you can see all that. And so I think that that's part of it. I think another part of practicing slow for me is I'm really interested in if this is going to sound abstract. I mean, probably everything I'm saying is, but can our perception of tempo come from a body learning place, from a body knowledge place? In the same way for dancers, tempo is perceived through, like, it's not an intellectual, like I I remember talking to a drummer friend years ago, and he had great time. And he's also a conductor of symphonic music. And I was like, what's your secret to the time? And he's like, I don't know. I guess I just hear a metronome in my head all the time. That did me no good at all. I was just like, I don't know what to do with that. Like, I try to hear a click, but is the click moving around? Probably. Like, so I think for me, this idea of going really slow draws so much awareness to physicality and to how I'm moving, which at drum set is a big deal. And also I'm trying to feel tempo more deeply, just as like a life goal. You know, I want to be able to have that physical knowledge. I want to be able to have that sensibility when I play with other people to kind of feel really grounded there. And I do feel that way in terms of groove, like being able to lock in and groove with other musicians. But there are certain tempos where I don't feel that way in terms of the time. Like I feel the time might move a little bit. And so, yeah, I think for that's a long-winded answer, but I think the short answer is I really believe in groove, and I love groove, and I love when music feels very grounded. I find that so exhilarating.
The other thing I wanted to ask you before we move on completely from this texture thing that was interesting is how much do you get the texture that you want through an original recording versus the processing in the end result?
Yeah, great question. Right. Both. Yeah, it depends. I think increasingly over time, trying to get it at the front end is big, but a lot of times that's just not how it goes, right? I'll be working on something and maybe I add a Wurlitzer at some point in the process, but then in the context, like, this doesn't sound right. Like, this is sticking out texture-wise. This texture doesn't feel good with what else is in there. So in that case, I'll reamp it and run it through a different amp or run it through a pedal or run it through something that destroys it. But I would say capturing it at the front end is great, but also doing it later in the process is great. However, later in the process, for me, it often goes through hardware still. So I do a lot of reamping through hardware stuff.
Interesting.
And I'm a big fan, I think, as we were talking about off air a little bit, of hardware. And I think part of the reason why is the limitations. I think part of the reason why is the physicality, the tactile aspect of it. And so if a texture isn't working, sending it through a pedal, a guitar pedal, you have very finite options. But sometimes that's exactly the right thing.
What's interesting about that to me is that it's potentially like a much slower way to work than it would be, for instance, to pull up whatever suite of plugins that you have available to you. Mm-hmm. So I'm also curious about do you have an opinion or a philosophy there in terms of how important it is to work fast versus slow versus at some other kind of pace?
My goal with mixing, if that's what we're talking about, and maybe not really with I guess my goal is always the utility tasks, all the housekeeping that are involved in the process, I want that to be as efficient as possible. And the creative tasks, no, I don't care about efficiency at that. And I separate them to say, like, if I'm mixing a vocal and I have to remove all the mouth click sounds from the vocal, that doesn't feel particularly like creative work to me, right? Or if I'm gain matching from clip to clip through a performance of something, it's more, that's what I'm calling administrative kind of work. So that stuff, yeah, I need to continue to and always want to make that efficient, so that then if I want to take time to send a sound out to a pedal or whatever, I'm not looking at the watch and worried, oh, I've already spent 10 hours on this, I can't do, or 20 or 5, I can't do this now, because I honestly, Toru, like, for me, if that was my mindset, the efficiency drive, I don't think I'd want to do this. I think I would have chosen a bad path for myself.
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting place, I think, to enter the idea of being a producer for other people.
Uh-huh.
Because in that context, right, it is creative, but you have a project that you're trying to complete. And I imagine there's at least some sense of deadline. It probably varies from project to project. That said, I imagine there are times where people are like, I want to get this done.
Yes.
And there's also that tension naturally that exists with, well, this is a creative thing, and there may be some paths that are less kind of A to B, less straightforward.
Yeah.
And how you balance that in working with people and trying to realize a creative vision.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think it's important to note that everyone's goals, timeline, and target kind of sound are different. So yeah, if someone's coming in with a deadline, hey, we need this by tomorrow, it's probably not the moment I'm going to pull out the pedals and start experimenting with reamping whatever. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's more about just clear communication with whoever the person is and figuring out, like, what are you trying to accomplish? What is your timeline? And let's go from there. Again, I don't feel, and this has sometimes been a strength and sometimes been a weakness, but I don't feel super dogmatic with any of my approaches. So it's not like I have I always reamp and I never do this, or I don't know. It depends, you know? And so for me, that in my own work, that follows from curiosity, because I'm not on a timeline with my own work, in the sense that I'm not with a label that's, you know, hammering down the door or whatever, asking for it, and there's no audience doing that. So with my own stuff, that pressure is moot. And when I'm working with other people, I don't really want to impose a dogma so much as I want to listen and respond. That's more interesting to me, and feels more like the call of what's needed.
How can you help somebody become a better listener and a better observer of the ideas that maybe somebody wants to communicate, but maybe doesn't have the words to?
And when you ask that, do you mean somebody like a musician I'm working with, or do you mean just someone out in the world who wants to become a better listener?
It's an interesting question. I think I'm asking it more specifically in the context of helping somebody produce a song that they're working on.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I would imagine there's overlap into, you know, beyond the room of working on a song. Okay,
so if you're talking about with someone who's trying to up their ear, like get better ears as a producer and with their own work, I think that interrupting the impulse to act right away is really important. So just listen. And especially nowadays, right? It's like harder and harder to do that. But when you're working in a digital environments with plugins, and all the plugins have presets, and all the presets have famous people's names attached to them or instruments attached to them, snare preset 1, you know, it's easy to just be like, all right, cool. Let me I'll throw this on the snare. I'll throw this on the kick, go to the preset, start there. But there's a lot to say for not putting anything on, getting a basic balance going, and just listening, and maybe doing that a lot. Maybe doing that several times, maybe doing that over the course of a day or two before you even dig in. Because what I find is a lot of times I catch myself where I'm like doing all this stuff, a mix or a creation of something is taking me a long time. And then I'll interrupt myself. This used to happen a lot. And I would say, like, wait, actually, what am I even doing? Like, why am I've loaded all these presets, and like I'm going down this path, assuming that there's this standard of excellence that I'm going to hit by doing that. But meanwhile, I've completely lost my perspective on this project, and perspective in production is the most important thing. Absolutely the most important thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I feel like you're describing essentially maybe habits, and maybe because things have worked and have produced results, or you've done things so many times that maybe even without thinking about it, you reach for certain things and you just start moving through in a way that, like, an instrumentalist maybe has certain vocabulary that they really go to in certain situations, that in a studio you may just start reaching for certain equipment or EQing things a certain way and so on. And it's interesting. I mean, there's obviously value in that, and I'm also, to your point, balancing that and maybe developing a sense of self-awareness. But it's that balance. How do you think about questioning what you're doing and also trusting what you're doing, and maintaining that in a way so that you don't hold yourself in place beyond, you know, what's necessary maybe?
Yeah, kind of goes back to what we were saying before, though, of really understanding the goals Is it your own work where it's wide open timeline and wide open process? Is it your own work where it needs to be done by tomorrow? Is it someone else's work where they're trying to hit a really specific target? I think that
Yeah.
that kind of framing for me is actually critical. I used to think it wasn't, but I think it is, to really, before you dive into this stuff, so before you even start listening with no plugins in and get your balance going, having a clear idea of, yeah, what am I doing here? Am I trying to crank something out, get it done quickly? Am I trying to hit a certain target? Or is this an open-ended process-based thing? Because without that clarity, I think it's just I think it's bound to be frustrating. Because then if it's in a rush and you're dilly-dallying, that's not good, and vice versa. So, yeah.
Are there times when you're working on your own projects and you find yourself actually putting on maybe separate hats and treating yourself the way that you would maybe a client to help yourself through something?
I'm trying to more and more. Yeah, it's hard. It sounds awkward when we put it in work, but yes, I mean that's really helpful. And I would say, like, in making my record, the one that you listened to, I definitely did that in the sense of chunking out time where I was like, okay, now I'm maybe not in the, yeah, I did pre-production. I did, like, now I'm going to work on lyrics. Now I'm going to work on generating some ideas. Now I'm going to revise. And these were, I was really clear about the phases and the structure and the time I gave to those phases, because I didn't want it to be, because I own a studio, it could easily be like, oh, I worked on this for 5 years and, here it is. And I didn't want that. So having structures, having imposed limits allows me to be really free within those limits. It's like, that's something I've learned. I know you journal, and I think journaling taught me that, because I realized over years of journaling, I always set a timer. It's like kind of ridiculous. I'll set a timer for whatever it is, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, however long I have. But then within that, completely free write. Zero structure within that. Could be a poem, could be a vignette, could be a reflection, could be lyrics, could be, I don't know, nonsense. But that frame of having the timer set for me is what allows me to be completely free within that. And I think similarly in making my own music, when you ask, do I put on these different hats like I do with other people, that's the way I put them on. I put them on with time limits and with defining the frame, but then within the frame, anything goes.
I love that. So is that the only constraint you typically work with journaling? Is time?
These days, yes. I've gone through different phases, but yes, for years now, yes.
And what's the reason that you journal?
It's kind of like you asking what's the reason why I'm practicing at slow tempos, where I think there's just a curiosity about and a dedication, I feel, to grounding practices that's really important to me, and journaling is one of those. It's how, like, I feel, I guess, normal, functional, and it also gives me a space to, because my identity is not wrapped up in it in any way, like it is with music, inevitably, because music is my career. With journaling, it's like I'm not a writer. I don't identify as a writer, so I can do anything. And that feels really important in terms of creative health, I think. Like just being able to come into the musical process with that, even if I can't always approach music like that, most of the time there's a governor on that, but just to have been priming that feels really important. Yeah.
And is the journaling something sporadic, or is there a particular cadence or schedule that you have in frequency?
Gone through different phases with that too. Right now, it's a few to several days a week. There's been times where it's every day, and then there's been periods where I step away from it for a while for whatever reason. Yeah.
And so is it kind of naturally flowing, or is there something usually that you find that's happening that you're like, okay, I know that this would be a good time for me to maybe spend or give more attention to journaling?
It's always a good idea for me to give more attention to it, to be honest. But some days I'm like, what am I doing here? This feels like a waste of time. I mean, but like how much, but then I step back and I'm like, what is a better use? Like, is scrolling online a better use of, When you start looking at 15 minutes, it's never a waste of time. But there are days where I feel that it is, and I'm questioning what I'm doing, and days where I feel more plugged in. But I always, at the end of the day, I would say it's always valuable for me.
I'm curious is the challenge in making music different or the same when you're working on your own creative work versus working to produce for somebody else?
Different. Yeah.
Can you speak to what they are in each case?
Working with other people, I'm responding, right? I'm listening. You and I are talking. I'm listening to what you're saying and responding. When I'm working alone, it's me and me. So, yeah. So I think that both, I can find my way into both, but I think that each of them has different struggles. And I think the struggle with responding to people is getting yourself out of the way, like not coming in with a rigid agenda, or allowing the other person their space. I think that's always a struggle for us. We want to insert ourselves into the situations. And I think on the other side, for the solo work, the challenge is maintaining perspective.
Yeah, what do you think it is that clients would say about you? What is it that you think people come to you for and appreciate your abilities or your work?
Oh man, I don't know. I have testimonials. You can read those. I hope that they come to me because I listen and I respond, and that on a sonic level, I hope that, I think that's a value of people I work with, is the sonics. And but in terms of the process, communication, that's super important to me. Communicating, being communicative through the process is really important. Yeah, so I would think that, I hope that that's a common thread.
Real quick, just going to take a little break from this conversation with Matt Wyatt to remind you of The Practice, which is an ongoing video archive library of guests on the show opening up their sessions via screen share and showing us how they do what they do. So Matt Wyatt's is already up and available now. In this, we talk about really kind of in the weeds, nerdy stuff. And I think if you're into figuring out how to get reverbs to sound better and more natural, potentially blending some, thinking about panning, thinking about arrangement with the different kind of sounds that you may use, this is an episode for you. So a reminder that it is free if you're subscribed to the podcast, and it is free to subscribe to the podcast. Producerhead.substack.com. Subscribe there, and I will send you access to The Practice. Back to the episode with Matt Wyatt. Right, it's interesting. In a way, it feels related to what we were talking about before in terms of like artistry and maybe like a base of technical competency.
Yeah.
And that in this case, that it's like you want to have a technical base, but that has a lot less to do with the experience that somebody has than what it is like to be in a room with you for however long it's going to take to complete the project.
Definitely.
So, yeah, can you speak to maybe some things that you've learned and what's helped you be a better collaborator, essentially, and, helping people get out of their own way maybe, or maybe even see the potential in something that wasn't there before?
I guess I would say the importance of deep listening. And by that, I mean, I guess I'm still talking in terms of getting yourself out of the way. So if you bring music to me and you show up with whatever seed idea, however evolved it is, that I'm taking time to listen to that with you, and that my work as I'm listening is to try to understand and really get inside where you're coming from. Because it's only once I do that I'm going to be of any use to you, is my belief. Otherwise, sure, I could not do that and flex technical skill or flex sonic skill or whatever it is, but that's of no interest to me. And as on the receiving end, when people have done that to me in my life, I've never felt fulfilled by that. It's never like, oh, that felt great, I'm so excited to work with that person again. It's more like, okay, I learned some stuff and I'm going to cut my losses and keep moving. So I think that if you're showing up and you want to work together, what you're asking me is, can I be present enough with you to hear you And that's not to say I'm not going to challenge you on certain things, or I'm not going to push you in certain directions. But if I'm not listening first, then I think the whole endeavor is doomed. Maybe not doomed in the completion sense. We might still get through the project. You might have something to release, might be well received, who knows. But in terms of building a long-term relationship, of working together, or in terms of helping you feel better about your creative process, I think it's doomed. And I mean, I should note, and it's obvious if you kind of look at my online presence, but I'm very much about process over product. Like I'm definitely, and that goes to working with other people. It's a little different because you're hiring me to mix a record. That's a product-based thing. But when it comes to producing and working with someone, or co-writing with someone, or in my own work, I think the process for me is the most fulfilling part. I'm not racing to get anywhere per se, so much as I'm attempting to build better relationships, better collaborations with people, to get deeper inside music and sound. And that is, I try to lead with that as much as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about for those of us that are trying to make more of a career out of this in other ways, whether it's working for other people or
Yeah.
making your own art. I'm curious about how you think about that, and how important, if you can speak to how important and the role that relationships have played in being able to sustain something over a longer period of time.
Huge. Yeah, huge. Because a lot of people I work with are repeat people, where we're doing multiple albums over years or whatever. A lot of people I teach for a long period of time. A lot of gigs I've played in my life. Maybe the gig hasn't lasted, that could be shorter or longer, but the people I play with, there's several people I play with, I've played with for a long time. And I also think word of mouth is still huge in terms of, even despite all the online stuff that we have and is helpful, word of mouth for me has been a huge help.
Yeah, I mean, I think another point you made that's interesting is that the process piece. And I think, I don't know, this is just the theory I have from listening, is that's really where you spend most of the time, right? Once the project is done,
right.
It's done and it's gone, and you don't, depending on what the plan is, there's maybe promotion and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But what you remember, in a sense, I would imagine in a lot of cases, is what was it like to work on this with this person, as opposed to what does the record sound like?
Yeah.
Because you spend more time working on it than you do listening to it, probably after the fact, in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
And I would add to that also and say, for me, when I look back, it's like, what was it like working with this person, and what did I learn and what did we learn? Because that's so much a part of it for me with creative work, is we're always trying to get deeper into it, improve at it, continue to evolve as creative people. And so I find that self-reflection is a key aspect of that. So yeah, you're right. Like 5 years after a record's done, might not have listened to it much, might not be thinking about the music much, but definitely I'm thinking, oh yeah, that was the record where like we got to this place, or I got to this place, or where I figured this thing out that I hadn't done, or where I really leaned into this technique that now I never want to do again in my life. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man.
Is this stuff making sense? I know I'm talking kind of abstract. I don't know if it's okay.
100%.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to flip this over for a second and
Sure.
say, because there's also people listening that may want to hire a producer or work with somebody, whether it's to learn or to collaborate, or maybe they're stuck in a place.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can they, in your experience, what have people done that have made it a lot easier for you
Mm-hmm.
and to make the experience better overall to get to where that artist was trying to go?
Say more about that. What you mean by that?
Well, I don't know if there's a sense of preparation
Oh,
or
gotcha.
attitude or something people can bring to a session and coming in, or maybe when you have an initial call with you, for instance, and they've never worked together before, like what are things that are usually good to have clear in your mind as an artist or somebody with a project to, hit the ground running if you
Gotcha.
will.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that can help with that. I think one is if you have any thoughts about the process, the that you want to pursue, the path you want to go down. Do you want to record live instruments? If you do you want to overdub? Are you working entirely with plugins? Are you working with this DAW or that DAW? That kind of stuff is super important because if you haven't defined that yet, it's a very different conversation than if you're like, oh no, here's how I work. I use whatever Fruity Loops, and this is like this is how I pursue it. And then I think another thing that helps is any demos, because then immediately I can listen and orient to what, even if it's unreleased work, even if it's like 20 seconds of a piece, but just something where it's like, okay, cool, this is like where you're coming from, and I can try to hear that. That kind of stuff is really helpful before meeting with someone the first time.
Very cool. So, for anybody watching and can see the background of your room, they might be shocked to know that you embrace a minimalist philosophy. So, can you talk about maybe what that is and why that is?
Yeah, I guess it's all relative, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, with audio, like with mixing and with recording, right. So if we're looking at the background, then I don't stand much of a chance, do I? I mean, yeah. The minimalist thing on the computer side for me is partly a patience thing and partly how I want to engage with music and partly sonics. So like I try to use as minimal plugins as I can get away with. But I also use a fair amount of hardware, outboard stuff. And I've invested in that over 20 years and like piece by piece tried to build that up. But I guess how I would say when it comes to gear is I've tried to stick with like, instead of buying 100 things that are maybe not that amazing in terms of build quality or sonics, I buy one thing. And I've tried to do that all along because I didn't want the kind of studio that people walk in and you're like tripping over broken gear that's like piled by the door or whatever. I've been in studios like that and they don't tend to feel great to me. So like, it was more like, okay, how can I do a slow build? So maybe part of the minimalism in my perspective, just computer aside for a moment, is trying to cultivate a sense of patience and doing this over time, building this over time, and in a way that is, again, focused. Like for me, the sonics are really important. I really love, I guess, fidelity, and I'm always trying to improve the fidelity that I'm kicking out in my own work and in other people's work. But also I think a lot about that. And so that gets into the plugin thing as well. There's, of course, different thoughts on this, but if you stack 8 plugins and 4 of them are EQs on one instrument, that can tend to deteriorate sound over time, particularly with EQ, because phase things happen, it gets weird. So there's that. But then on the other end of that spectrum is I just can't handle that many plugins because I start losing my way. And I feel like I've gone into clicking decision, like the space of tiny moves. So in terms of like recording, I try to do utility stuff in the DAW, phase alignment, balancing, automation, levels, that panning, that stuff, corrective EQs, and then creative stuff like I'm going to distort this with the decapitator. I'm going to, throw echo all over this. But I try to keep it, fairly minimal, I guess. And then I'll add to that from a different hat. As a maker, I think my minimalism comes from probably a place of like when I sit at piano, I don't have tons of chops. So I can't razzle and dazzle you with like my acrobatics. So there's a certain commitment there. I say like to touch, to texture, to the tone, to the feel, to the groove, if there's a groove. And then I consider that a kind of minimalist approach.
What do you think? Because it can be hard when you know that there's something you want and you can't have it, whether it's because it's something you just can't find, or it's out of like what's financially realistic for you.
Yep.
You know, a friend of mine, you know, we always say, like, there was times where I was struggling with things like that. And you think about buying maybe the lesser than,
Yep.
you know, or the thing that isn't really. And he would always say, buy what you want and you only cry once. And
That's good.
so I'm curious about, you know, how you feel about that, and also maybe what you've learned by being patient and working slowly, because as you mentioned, there were times where it's like maybe you had, you know, the distressor was on your list and you were like, you know, I can't get there yet.
Yeah.
And what you maybe learned in the interim before you could have one, because you still had to work with some kind of compression or get the work done you were working on at that time.
Yeah.
So maybe just like how that continued to shape your thinking, because I imagine it probably creates a little bit of a feedback loop for yourself where you're like, no, I can wait. And you have a little bit of this evidence of what you gained through not having something.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's a good question, man. And I feel the frustration of that because it never ends, right? A friend of mine described like gear as like an arms race where like you feel like, yeah, I've got great gear. And then you look at so-and-so's studio website and it's like, oh man, I'm nowhere. Like, you know, which is such a ridiculous kind of consumerist focus, but it happens. So I think that I try to, no matter what the thing is. So like, all right, you don't have much money, so you could buy like one guitar pedal. Guitar pedals do amazing things for drums. They do amazing things for all kinds of instruments. And there's a lot of guitar pedals out there that are affordable. And I would say like, for me, what's been helpful is having that guitar pedal and saying, how do I really learn this thing? And like, what is it? Okay, so let's say it's a distortion. Well, if it's distortion, it has at a minimum, it's going to have tone and drive. Pretty much always have tone, like bright to dark. And so automatically it's an EQ and it's saturation. Try that thing on everything you can, like everything. That's, for me, is how I approach stuff. Where I'm like, okay, I know distortion is not supposed to be used on this thing over here, but I'm going to try it. And then when you jump to the next thing, you have some comparison, like some basis for comparison other than all the marketing lingo, which I found is really hard. The marketing lingo is hard to make sense of. It's like when I'm listening to something, I'm like, yeah, I think it's warm. I think it's, creamy. Like, I'm not sure. But when I know where I came from before, and all of a sudden with this new thing, I'm like, oh, the bass sounds killer. It's like wide and whatever words I want to assign to it. If I know that, then great. I keep moving. I don't need to fuss over it too much. So I think that with me, the biggest thing was I always had a commitment to hardware, even when I had hardly any budget to it. Like I always saw hardware as like, I want to work with hardware. I love working with hardware. I love having hands-on with things and being able to change stuff. And I like the limitations of it. And I like what it can do to tone. So if you have that commitment, then I think just paying attention and experimenting are the keys.
And what's your sense of disparity at this point between like a UAD 1176 plugin versus an 1176? Or the distressor, to continue that example, a UAD distressor plugin versus a physical distressor?
I don't know that I want to. This is a very polarizing road, right? Like, because you have just as much as you have people who say like plugins sound horrible, they don't sound anything like the real thing. You have people, great mixers, who are only using plugins and getting top-notch results. My sense of it is when I run sound through nice hardware compressors, there's a physicality to the sound that is undeniable. It like takes on a quality of, depth, width, resonance that to my ears is like, okay, cool. And it's quick. Like you talked earlier about efficiency. I'm way more efficient working with hardware than I am fiddling around with software in certain tasks, right? EQ can be different, but when we're talking about certain tasks, I can get to the results I want quicker in terms of the basic palette. And so, so I'm not sure an 1176 plugin by UA versus Waves versus whoever versus the hardware. I'm not sure, but I know for me, I like working with the physical stuff. It feels better. It feels more engaging, and the results are quicker, and they feel more impactful right out of the gate. And I think that what I understand about it is a lot of top mixers who only work with plugins, they're using a lot of plugins to get at the result of one piece of hardware. Yeah, so I don't know. I maybe that's enough of. I don't know if I'm happy to go more technical, but I don't know how important that is. But
Well, I guess I'm not necessarily asking. Like, I'm not asking. At least for me, I'm not coming from a place of like what's better, hardware or software. I don't know if this is true or not. My feeling is qualitatively, you're in a place where it's like if all you have access is to software,
yeah,
you can make good enough music. Probably.
definitely, yeah.
Now, and beyond that, I think maybe more interesting, and I don't know because my experience, like as we've talked about a little bit offline, my experience with hardware is much more limited. But
as we look behind you at what you have, yeah.
But in terms of using kind of processing gear,
yeah,
and so I would say what's interesting and what I notice as you talked about, for instance, running your stuff through pedals or through compressors, is how much more you really are listening. And I think part of what's interesting about plugins is the emphasis naturally on how they look.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
And the whole point. And so what I was actually kind of wanting to ask you a little bit more about was how to encourage people to maybe use their ears more even as they're using plugins. Because what happens is I think I would imagine you look a lot less, or not that you don't look at it, but you're not just focused on how much gain reduction is this distressor showing me, and you're just listening to what it's doing. And I think naturally, because like what we're doing is pulling a thing up, dragging it into a place, and all of these things, that you do tend to look, and myself included, that I find myself drawn to the flashing lights and things like this on the screen, as opposed to like, oh, maybe I should actually just close my eyes, and MIDI map this controller, or I have my mouse, and A/B these things, not looking at the screen, because it's hard to recreate that sense of the hardware where it really is a tactile thing, and you're not looking at a waveform on a screen necessarily as you tweak this. You know what I mean?
Definitely, I do. Yeah. And I think you just answered your own question. I think just not looking at it. Like, especially with EQ, like, let's start there. Not necessarily closing your eyes, but just like push the thing off to the side of the screen, or just don't focus your attention on it. And, first position your mouse so that it's over whatever one of the points of the EQ. And then without paying attention to how much of a cut or boost you're making, start moving things and listening. I think you're right. Another thing I can say that I find really helpful is using plugins for tasks that is not their main job. So, like, for example, I love Sound Toys plugins. Are amazing. Echo Boy, Decapitator, those. The Devil Lock also they're all EQs as well as whatever their main function is, whether it's echo or distortion. And I love that, because immediately it's like I'm not coming into using that plugin with an assumption of like, oh, this is the character of the Decapitator as an EQ. Nobody's talking about that. Everybody's talking about the character of it as a distortion device, or Echo Boy as an echo device. And so once you get into using its tone knobs, I think there's less preconceptions. Fewer preconceptions that you're bringing into it. And maybe that allows you to listen more honestly.
Really cool. Can you speak more on those? Like, especially because for me, it's more intuitive to think about saturation plugins like a Decapitator as something that could be perceived more EQ, but an echo or an ambience generator, I would think that's not nearly as intuitive to me. So can you speak more on that?
So if we're talking about that specific device, Echo Boy, it has all these models that are based on different classic models, the Echoplex, Space Echo, blah, blah, blah. And each of those has a different tone. So even if you just keep your settings the same on the Echo Boy and you jump between what they call master tape and Telray and Echoplex, those three, you're going to hear it get darker or brighter depending. And then there's also tone controls on the device. that you can use. With the decapitator, there's the low cut and the high cut, and then there's a tone knob, and then there's whatever the 5 modes are that are letters, A, N, whatever, E. And so all of those sound very different because they're all based on different historical hardware, and historical hardware always has like a starting point tonal palette. So even without using brightness and darkness knobs, just by jumping through some of these different models, you're immediately, it's a form of EQ, you know? And you don't have to do, I don't think you have to do it for like years, because that would take years. I think it's more just like, all right, what do these 3 sound like? Like if it's the decapitator, am I actually hearing what these different letters do to the tone? And if it's the Echo Boy, am I hearing what Master Tape does compared to the Echoplex, compared to the Telray? Like, how are these different?
Yeah, and, you know, kind of like what we were talking about at the top with the texture thing, I'm curious about how, for yourself, maybe in your own mind, what are examples of words that you use to log those kinds of differences?
The easiest is
really,
if we're talking like if we're talking bright to dark, I think that language is the easiest. Is like where is this on the brightness to darkness, and then it can get granular within that, right? As far as like airy, is it airy? I mean, most tape things are not necessarily bringing a ton of air, but like meaning, is it the top where like the details of the voice come really forward and take on an intimacy, but also feel more present than life or something like, or is it the upper mids, or is it the, you know, so starting to hear within the different parts of the frequency spectrum. But even without going there, I think just like, where is this from bright to dark, and how does this make me feel in the context of the music I'm working on right now? Because this is the thing where I said earlier, like, I think perspective is everything with producing music, especially producing your own music, where it's up to you to define the direction. It's like, there isn't a wrong tone. There isn't a sound that's by nature bad. I mean, some are more pleasant or less pleasant to listen to, you know, but like, I think that context is everything. So really knowing, and I think the way we can develop a compass for context is just charting your own reactions to something as you listen. So as you jump between these different modes and you're like, oh, darker, brighter, okay, you're also listening to the big picture and you're saying, how does this feel in the context of these other sounds? That's like more important than whether it objectively sounds like an 1176 or a Space Echo or whatever. Is how does it feel, and how does it pair, and how does it balance with everything else?
Gotcha.
I'm used to, like, when I talk about this kind of technical stuff, I'm used to people starting to yawn. So
no, man,
I appreciate your questions. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, I really hope for everybody listening. I mean, there's so many even passing small details that I think are worth a revisit and a rewind and applying some of these things.
Oh, good.
Because of, I think so much of the subtlety, and like, I like that we've been somewhat mechanical in giving ideas about how to kind of work a little bit blind if you're working in plugins, because I do think there's just like, so like, I just think at the core of no matter what kind of music you're trying to make, to develop your ear, and whether that's like in a classical sense of like getting your intervals tighter and hearing chord changes, or to your point, can I hear a 1 dB bump or cut? Can I hear that? You know, if you can develop that sensitivity, what it can do to your music is really hard to quantify, not to mention to how much more you'll just appreciate and enjoy the experience, I think. That said, it's hard to, I think, get to that place. So I think just, again, like some of the really specific things that we've talked about, thinking about things, I think there's parallels in the way that you talked about kind of being genre agnostic and also not necessarily following rules. So for instance, just naming an example, like taking a guitar pedal and using it on drums, just this idea of that everything is just a thing and you can put it anywhere. You know what I mean? And I think especially with plugins. So anyway, for everybody listening, I think there are a lot of really small passing details that you've mentioned that offer a lot of depth, you know?
Good.
And so
yeah,
I really
I want to add
appreciate
one
you
thing to
bringing
what
them
you
up.
just said, because you say like being able to hear a 1 dB cut or something, right? Which is what you're talking about is developing chops, like golden ears, right? Where, oh, that's a half a dB cut at 650 hertz or whatever. But I think part of what I'm saying here is that doesn't matter. Like that matters in certain contexts. That matters a lot. But if you're at a place where you have no idea what that means, or you have no idea if your plug-in compressor that visually looks like an 1176 is actually behaving like one, that's okay. The key is just being aware of what you're hearing. That's what I'm trying to say. So like, yeah, if I can't hear a cut of it's 650 hertz of half a dB, like, oh man, I guess I'm not meant to be an engineer. Like I should just quit now. Like, but if you aren't paying attention to that and you're more responsive to the environment, how it's mixing with the other sounds, how everything's working together, to me, that's the real chop. That's like, when it comes to chops, that's the most useful of all chops.
I mean, there you go, man. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that distinction.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it's just, really cool. So I did want to ask you a little bit about, just your experiences as being an entrepreneur and what that's like, because I think for creative people, a lot of times it just naturally feels at odds with being quote unquote creative. You know? And so I'm wondering if you have anything you'd like to share in your experience about what it's been like to, speaking to the different things that you do and how it's maybe developed over time. I don't know how much of what you're doing right now has been a vision that you've had since you were 5 years old, and this is all now just like realizing and what that path has been like, So it's kind of intentionally open-ended to where you'd like to take it.
Yeah, not a plan since I was 5 years old. Definitely not. I can say like I don't even know if I ever intended to become a musician, to be honest with you. It was just like something I was so preoccupied with and obsessed with that it started to happen. And I'm not advocating for that. I don't think that's like great career advice, but for me, that was the truth. It was like, okay, I just want more time to be able to do this. And when I was just hitting the workforce, the way that I managed that was by teaching a ton. I taught drums a lot as a young person and covered my bases, and I was playing a lot of gigs because I'm a drummer and people need drummers. So I think that those two things kind of started happening, and I coupled that with living as cheaply as I could outside of a small town in the boonies and trying to create a lifestyle like you are doing, where where you're guarding a certain amount of your time really fiercely and just saying like, this time is for my priorities, whatever those are. And for me, a lot of those priorities were musical practice, creating stuff, whatever, getting better at recording. But yeah, so where I started, it wasn't like a lifetime vision, and the recording thing wasn't a part of it at first for me. I had recorded as a kid with a 4-track cassette and like a terrible microphone, and I had a setup in my parents' garage, and I would record myself playing drums, or I would do field recordings, or I was really into poetry as a kid, like as a teenager. I would record poems. I would sample the poems. I would sample the bird song, the same stuff I'm doing now, really. So that had happened in my teen years, and it wasn't really until I was in my 20s and I was playing in a bunch of bands that then people I'm playing with are like, oh, you know, because I always had some kind of gear, an interface and a couple mics or whatever, and be like, oh, you have enough, why don't you record us? And really so talk about word of mouth, that was how my business started, was from just knowing musicians, playing with musicians, and people being like, record us. Okay, cool. And then out of that, it kind of grew to other people asking, oh, I'm a friend of so-and-so who you play with. Like, can you record this or mix this or whatever? And that's sort of developed over time. So, yeah, so for me, a big key, and I think you and I had touched on this off air, is the diversification. I think in music, that's huge. And for me, everybody's, financial needs obviously are different, but for me, there was always a need to be like, all right, what's going to cover my bases for this period of time? Like what within my various threads, and teaching was that for a long time, teaching teaching private lessons and stuff, and then it shifted at different points, and now it shifted more in the direction of studio work. And there were times where performing was a more major, like I would lean on one direction or another based on what was happening. But that's been really helpful, I think, and keeps me helps for engagement too.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of really practical sense for diversification. I think there's a reason Amazon and Uber have all the different things that
Right,
they offer.
yeah,
And I think people forget how much that is out of necessity, really. But I think there's a lot of also practical value as a creative when you're like, most of us have more than one interest.
Yeah.
And so to be able to go to those different places and take a break also, right? Because it's like you don't always want to teach or you don't always want to be mixing. You want to have time to do these other things.
Totally. Yeah.
And so there's a lot of just, I think, probably sanity that comes along with diversification also.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome, man. So before we get into, I know I'm excited you're going to share a session with us. I just have some of these short form questions, but feel free to be I'm not going to ask you to cater the length of your response. Let's say that.
Okay.
What's your most used piece of hardware right now?
Most used or most appreciated?
Why don't we do both?
I mean, most used converters. I use Burl converters and a summing mixer. I have an outboard summing mixer, so everything's coming and going through those. The summing mixer is an Inward Connections Mix 690, and I would say my most loved piece of gear is probably a Highland Dynamics BG2, which is a compressor, super colorful compressor. Yeah.
That's cool. I'm not familiar.
Yeah, it's
Best
great.
free,
Super nice.
yeah. Best free plugin or tool you'd recommend to everybody?
There's a, for everybody, I was going to say a metering plugin that's I think it's by Clevgrand or something, but I don't know that that's particularly thrilling for folks. For a while, Sound Toys was offering something free that was a reverb echo thing but that maybe was because I had already bought in. I'm not sure, man. I have to come back to this one. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, I meant to bring this up. Are you familiar with Air Windows?
No.
So I like to mention this guy because I hope people go support him if they're interested, but he makes his whole motto is in space nobody can hear your screen. And so he builds these really like super generic looking plugins where it's just like sliders with just labels about what the parameters are.
Wow.
And it's completely like a donation based thing. So you can download them for free. You can pay what you want, that kind of thing. But he makes his emulations of whatever kind of stuff, and all of them are just, here's the parameter, here's the slider, 0 to 100, that kind of thing. And that's all that it is.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
So really low CPU load, that kind of thing, really just focused on. So it's an interesting ethos that he has.
I will say it's not free. They were $50 US forever. I assume they still are, but the Valhalla stuff is all amazing.
Yeah, I really love the reverbs, man. I use it all the time.
Yeah.
One production technique that you overuse?
Distortion. Definitely.
That was a very quick answer.
Yeah.
What's a record you've sampled? Do you sample records ever?
No.
Okay.
I sample my grandfather. I sample tapes I inherited of my grandfather speaking.
Yeah, that's really cool. You told me that. That's really cool. Yeah. People, you need to go hear this project. The Matt Wyatt project. Go check it out. What's the album called again?
Exist Everywhere.
Exist Everywhere. I know one day I need to pick up that record from you, man. A producer whose process you'd want to spend a day watching.
Big Danger Mouse fan. I'd be curious to see how Danger Mouse works. Yeah, especially because he's done such a range of stuff. Yeah.
Is there a particular project of his that really hits for you?
There's a bunch of stuff of his that hits, but he did a Ennio Morricone tribute that was called Rome, I think. And then the stuff he did with MF Doom was really cool. Yeah, super cool. I would say those are a few that really hit for sure. But I think part of what's interesting to me with him is I'm very curious, like, what the generative side of his work is. Like, what is he creating versus what is he sampling? What is he doing with hardware versus what is he doing with software? There's a lot there about his process that I don't understand. And maybe it's out there on the internet, but, you know, it also seems like he's a fairly introverted dude. So I don't know how easy it is to find things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, yeah, Danger Doom I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there something in the studio that you've been meaning to organize and procrastinating?
Yes. Yes, there is. Yeah, there's always hardware stuff that's in need of attention. It's not really organizing, but I would say like storage. You know, being a drummer, there's like, oh, I have several snare drums and this and that and a couple kits, and just, you know, being more organized with that would go a long way. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, have you kind of out of necessity become somebody that's now also a maintenance person on hardware, or do you have to take that to the shop?
I'm a dummy.
When it goes awry.
I take it to a shop. Yeah, I'm a total dummy. Yeah, I can talk about the tone and the texture, but yeah, no.
Yeah.
I wish I had those skills, but also the time required to develop those skills is real.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I'd imagine too. It's like you invest so much into those, you take it to somebody you can trust to.
That's
to
huge.
Repair them properly.
I would not trust myself in that context.
It's not something you play on.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
3 artists that changed how you think about music.
Don Cherry would be one. He was a trumpeter, played with Ornette Coleman. Also played with Ed Blackwell, who's a drummer I like a lot. Gilberto Gil, who's a Brazilian legend. I love Brazilian music. And I remember when I first heard an album of his called Espresso Dois 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 Dois, that it was just like, what is going on? Like, sonically, it's super exciting. And just his way of singing is so deep. It's so in the pocket and groove, but it's also so free. Maybe in the same way like Bob Marley could be, or something, where the phrasing is just open and feels so loose. But if you hone in on any given moment, you're like, wow, that is so on. And I saw him, I guess, a little before the pandemic. He was in DC, and I went up and saw him. And he is also like a super joyous performer in the way that someone like Bobby McFerrin is, where it's just like, and the band was, of course, incredible. And so, yeah, he for me was a big, when I first tuned into certain records of his, it really was huge. And then I would say, as a youngster, Nas was a big deal for me when I was coming up. Illmatic, It Was Written, those records were big. Dilla Donuts was big. Last year, a couple years ago, there was a record by a guitar player named Oren Embarki it's a trio. It's called Ghosted 1, 2, and 3. And the first 2 albums are amazing. I mean, it definitely it hit something for me that I've been trying to get at in my own music, in the sense of like, he's a guitarist, but on these particular albums, you wouldn't even know it's a guitar most of the time. He's like running a reverb through a Leslie speaker, and it's just texture. And then it's bass and drums with great grooves. The bass is very repetitive, kind of static ostinato figures, and the drummer is very free, but always at a very low level, quiet, using like a kind of drum cushion setup where it's like a kit percussion hybrid. And so that album for me, especially Ghosted 2, was really deep as well.
Really cool.
Yeah.
Is there somebody in music that you feel like is maybe underappreciated that you wish more people knew about?
Sure. You, I think, for one. I think so
That's
many
really
of
nice
us
of you
who
to
are
say.
toiling away,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a group I heard, kind of got turned on to them within the last few years, called the Meridian Brothers. Do you know them from Colombia?
No.
Yeah, check it out. Very interesting stuff. I think it's one dude who makes he's like the producer, composer, all the things, but he tours with the band. But that stuff I feel like is incredible, and I think in Colombia has more traction in certain markets elsewhere. But yeah, it's like very innovative production. A lot of techniques where I'm like, I have no idea how they're creating this sound here and what's going on, and I like that feeling of feeling like, and yet they're familiar. It's, oh, this is kind of cumbia, or this is salsa inflected, but then the sonic palette is not that, and there'll be aspects that are so not that. So there's a certain, like I was saying earlier, like a genre agnosticism or a genre fluidity there that I really like.
Yeah, I can see the bookshelf back there, so I'm curious about if there are any books that have been super formative, like, I don't know, really impactful for you, that stick with you. Maybe you revisit them, whether it's like something that's been for a long time or maybe something really recent.
Yeah. There are a bunch of poets that I revisit, and poetry books that I love to pick up. And the beautiful thing about poetry to me, and I'm not a poet, but is it's a world you inhabit that is created very minimally. So we talk about minimalism. It's like, oh wow, there's maybe just 3 lines on this page. Maybe it's whatever, 50 lines. But if you are able to tune into that poet, you're in that world immediately. And I think that's always a quality I'm looking for in music as well. So there's a lot of crossover there where I feel like not only can a poem express certain truths that we're not going to get at any other way, but it also has this way of world building and kind of like doing that in a really efficient way where each thing really matters, each word, the sound of the words, whatever. And similarly, fiction, I like to read fiction books for that reason, where I just feel like it's an escape. It's a way to kind of tune out, but it's also a way where I feel like I get inside of a world that an artist has created and learn things that apply to music as well.
Are there any in particular that you'd recommend?
Fiction?
Sure, and poetry?
Yeah, there's a poet named Shinkishi Takahashi, Japanese poet. Pretty abstract stuff, worth checking out. There's a book called After Images that's amazing. And another poet that a friend introduced me to, Dean Young, also pretty abstract stuff, like mashup, a lot of different things coming together. So that's good there. And then fiction-wise, I just recently reread and completed Cormac McCarthy's Border Trilogy, which is pretty amazing stuff. Yeah, I'd say those are good starting points for me.
Cool.
Yeah.
What's something about the music industry that you think would surprise an outsider?
Can I ask you that question?
That's an interesting. Nobody's asked me that.
After we're done, I get to flip all this and interview you.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. I think that I think the most, I guess in my experience, I think would be, and maybe this isn't like industry, but I think maybe, for instance, if I meet somebody and they ask me what I do and I say, well, I make music, their response, if they're not a musician especially, is usually something, oh, that must be so nice.
Yeah.
And it is, don't get me wrong, like I do other, that's why I do it. But also that I think this applies maybe more broadly to creative or artistic things in general, that I think people think it's this like, I'm sort of prancing around a room throwing paint at a wall kind of thing. You know what I mean?
And I like that you said prancing too. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I would say that, and it's not, I'm not angry about it. I just think it is like a misconception about what it is to show up to a space like this every day and try to do something related
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. I think that that would be something that most people don't know how hard musicians
Mm.
have to work and are working. And not only in
Mm.
terms of the business building stuff, um, or the income generating stuff, but also with maintenance, like the craft and the pursuit of your instrument or instruments or voice as a producer or whatever. Yeah,
Mm.
I think that was something that I like thinking about your career path question. Um, I think at a certain point, I assumed that if I got good enough, that opportunities in the music industry would open, and to some extent, that's true. But it's not true in the way that I thought it was, and it wasn't like, oh, I'll get so good that I'll be famous. That wasn't really my mo. But more like, I think it's not to say talent doesn't matter, but talent is not. It's just a part of the pie, you know. And I
Mm-hmm.
think as much as that is, if we're talking about the studio side, it's relational. You know, can you communicate with people? How are you to be around? Competency totally matters, but it's not necessarily the driving force. Same with playing also. Like I used to feel like, oh, to get any kind of serious performing work, I need to be at a totally masterful level. And
Mm-hmm.
it's actually not the case. So yeah, I think you're right. Like people don't know how hard musicians have to work, do work. And then I would add to that that maybe as musicians ourselves, we don't even know that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about it kind of really, is in line with some of the stuff we were saying earlier about what it is to be in the process with you, whether that's performing or working in a studio, writing a
Mm-hmm.
song together, right? There is a level of, and even to your point about reminding us that having an elite level of chops as an engineer, like it's cool if you can get to that point, but there is this balance of like having a talent or a skill that's practically applicable and that nobody can succeed alone. And so that the type of person that you are cannot be understated in the role of your success.
Definitely. Yeah. And you just said something that speaks to like a lesson that took me a long time to accept and learn is the importance of connecting with other people. And I had a
Mm-hmm.
mentor at a certain point who was all about connection. Like, you know, I would go in and meet with him and talk with him and just be like, man, I can't, you know, like I'm horrible at self promotion and I feel this way and that way and whatever. And his response would be reach out to people, reach out and you know, whatever, like reach out for help and support in that area, or reach out to other
Mm-hmm.
musicians for lunch or whatever it is, or whatever. Like just instead of just staying in your own zone, which especially on the studio side, as you know, we can all kind of fall into it. This isolation is always close at hand in studio
Mm-hmm.
town, I think. And so reaching out and really trying to work against that is also a way to work against this idea that we all have to be masterful before we're valid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can achieve your way out of loneliness. So, best piece of unsolicited advice you've ever ignored and maybe should not have.
I think certain people would say I ignore a lot of advice. Uh, what would be something that I mean? I think again, kind of going back to you and how much I look up to what I understand of what you're doing is like the idea of eating the frog or whatever, like doing the first things first in the morning, the thing that you know that if you don't do it right away, you're not going to get. For some people, that's exercise. For some people, that's their creative work, whatever. That I feel like I'm ignoring and relearning and reminding myself of over and over and over again. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think it's very important to have that down.
If you could change one thing about the internet, what would it be?
Uh, a mass exodus from social media.
And then
Yeah.
if you were a character or a movie from a movie, who would you be?
Uh,
Could be a book, TV show.
I don't know that I could name a character so much as there's certain like character voices that I wish I could inhabit. Like or author, like a voice of a writer. A lot of times I wish I could inhabit that voice. There's a famous Portuguese poet named Fernando Pessoa, and he wrote from different personalities, almost like what nowadays is really popular in the psychotherapy world of parts work. And he would literally write a book. Oh, this is from this guy's perspective, and he's a doctor, and this is how he moves through the world. And this is from this other person's perspective, and this is what they do. And I think that I remember when I first was exposed to his work, there was a feeling I had of, man, I would love to be able to inhabit that, whatever created that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not really a character, but character voice.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to answer that. Is there anything else that actually? There's one more thing that that's kind of come up that I haven't asked you. Mm-hmm. How important is it underneath all of this, if you want to be a musician, producer, whatever, to be a really serious fan? And I'm asking because as we've kind of delved, throughout this conversation more and more, it's just become clear about how much music you listen to across genres and across time periods and the different things that you read and consume. It seems like there's a really intentional diet of a variety of things that you take in artistically. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because we haven't really talked about taste or anything like that throughout this conversation.
Yeah, and you're asking how important do I think that is for people who are doing this as a profession, or just for humans, or?
Yeah, I think it could be both, but I think in terms of the role, it's the role you think it plays in your own ability and influence as a producer or musician, because your ability to mix, right? If somebody comes in and wants to mix a certain kind of music, if you're not familiar with that kind of music. Right. I say it because I also think it's easy if you're somebody, for instance, let's say you're really heads down and you're making a ton of music, you can also get into a place where maybe you're not listening to other stuff.
Definitely. Yeah.
And so I'm curious about, I just don't think it's an accident. So I'm curious about maybe it is. Maybe it's not a conscious thing for you. I don't know, but that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, good question. For me, it keeps me plugged in where it matters, I would say, is the answer to that. And I think that particularly being a career musician, it's easy to get distracted by all the things we're supposed to be doing, and to get distracted by the specific way we're supposed to be doing those, right? Here, if you want to succeed, here's the path. This is what you need to do. You need to do A, B, C, and D. And I guess that sounds like it's an off-topic answer, but for me, listening is why I got into this. Listening is where this all came from. I didn't have, as a kid, it wasn't like I want to be the Michael Jordan of drums or whatever. It was like I was playing because of my love of listening, and that still feels true. It's like the more I learn about piano and drums and my, using my voice in different ways or whatever, the deeper I can hear things when I listen, and that's so satisfying. So I think for me, there's a deep intrinsic reward in listening to music. And yeah, I've never been very genre specific in my listening, and I'm not very, as I told you earlier, it's just not how I'm wired, I guess. But I feel like the same with reading, where it's like when I'm tapped into that, it helps my value system to stay aligned where I want it to be on the things that matter to me. And it's a way I can contend with all the oversaturation of, media and information around us. Is like, if I'm tuned into these practices of listening and reading and reflecting in these ways, journaling, then things just make more sense, I guess I would say, for me. Yeah. Not to mention with music and books and art in general, just the aesthetic joy. I love when things sound good or when things sound terrible, but the intention is really inspiring. I love that. It's just like pleasant. It's like eating a really satisfying meal or something, where it's like, man, this is just enjoyable. And trying to be present with that feels like a really deep life practice as much. It's, I guess, in the sense of being meditative, also in the sense of being our capability and our ability to say, like, I can be present and listen and sit here and listen while not scrolling through a million things, or I can just take this in and try to be aware of what I'm feeling, try to be if it makes me move, how am I moving, what's it like, if it makes me want to rest, I don't know, that intersection of the aesthetic experience and self-awareness is also super intriguing to me, just in a like existential sense. Yeah.
Right on, man. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to these people before we get out of here?
Yeah, there was, I think if insofar as our audience is some amount of aspiring engineers and producers, right? So like, I remember when I was younger feeling, and like early on in this path of learning some of this stuff, I would always read these interviews and tape op and stuff with, famous producers or whatever. And it would say like, the gear doesn't matter, it's all about your whatever. And then I would go look at their gear list and I'd be like, what? Like, you have like a vintage Neve console and the gear doesn't matter? Like, what?
Yeah.
It's like you drive a Ferrari and the car doesn't matter? Like, and I think that for me has been a very real thing to reckon with over time. And especially in light of what you said earlier of like, money is always limited. How do we afford the things we want, whether it's plugins or hardware or whatever? And one way I've reckoned with that on my own is the gear definitely does matter, but the point isn't that you can, and I and all the rest of us, like mortals, can afford the things that some of these greats have access to. But the point is that we're aware of what we're working with and how we're working with it. And that's really helped me as far as like, okay, maybe I can't get the Ferrari, but like we were talking about earlier, I'm going to run sounds through this, $30 distortion pedal I got at the pawn shop. And like, what am I hearing? How's it making me feel? What is this? What is the potential here? So yeah, but that's, I don't know, maybe it's more of a personal gripe, but I used to tick me off so much because I read these things and be like over and over, the gear doesn't matter. The gear doesn't matter. Be like, what? Yeah.
Right. When a wealthy person tells you that money doesn't matter.
But, but listening and tuning into the gear is rewarding. And, also just to commend you, and I've done this off air, but I love that you're doing this podcast, and I think you're asking great questions. And I also appreciate how much space you're giving for response. Like, I never talked this much, certainly not about geeky tech stuff, but in general. And you're doing a great job, and it's a beautiful thing, man. I think you're really modeling listening, like what it is to listen to another human and to ask meaningful questions. And so, yeah, props to you for that. I know it takes a lot of time and energy. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. The compliment is not lost on me. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, man. And for everybody listening, we are going to jump into a session. So go check that out on the practice playlist after this. But this concludes the episode with Matt Wyatt. Thank you so much for listening. This is Toru. We will catch you in the next one. Peace.
Thanks, Toru.
That's it for my conversation with Matt Wyatt. Check out his studio, Tree and Boom Studio. Hit him up for work. Check out his album, Exist Everywhere. And if you want to see the DAW session that he shared with us, where we talked arrangement and a little bit of mixing, if you're subscribed to the podcast, you get free access to the practice. It also costs you nothing. It is free to subscribe to the podcast. Producerhead.substack.com, and I will send you a link to the video where you will see how he works, as well as guests from past interviews and episodes. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Toru. We will catch you in the next episode. Peace.